Chapter 7. The Beginning of Pistol Training. The Border Patrol had no firearms marksmanship training program. Every officer armed himself, and because most of the weapons they packed were of calibers which necessitated the individual purchasing his cartridges, he was pretty chary about bringing them up in practice. If, however, he toted a revolver like the Smith & Wesson Model 1917, he could then shoot the .45 ACP, which was issue stuff. My first choice was the Smith & Wesson, and I shot the 6-gun until I wore out the barrel. Then I sent it back to Springfield. The company very generously installed a new tube. This saved me $5.50, which was a considerable sum in those days. At any rate, the El Paso police, who had neither a training program nor a place to practice, challenged us to a pistol match. There was a little 2-bit pistol range consisting of 10 targets and a distance of 25 yards on the Mesa Road. It actually belonged to the El Paso Rifle Club, and when they learned the local minions of the law were going to shoot it out with the Border Patrol, they invited themselves. It was a tough match, notable for a lot of goodwill and awfully poor scores. The El Paso Pistol Club had run in a couple of ringers in the shape of 2 members of the U.S. Cavalry Pistol Team, a one-eyed shark named Wilczewski, and First Sergeant Wade Fitzgerald. Despite this somewhat formidable opposition, the Border Patrol won the match. I was the high gun. The police, who had initiated the affair, wound up in third money. It was the beginning of a long series of matches, finally culminating in the 8th Corps area pistol matches on the self-same dinky little shooting grounds. This was some 2 years after the first Shoot Fest. Encouraged by my first success, and with abiding love for the handgun, I commenced to practice in deadly earnest. I set up a range at Strauss and shot every other day. Colt had just produced a new Target 38, the Shooting Master, and I acquired this new model and liked it very much. The revolver weighed 43 ounces with 6-inch barrel, and was a big frame gun meant not for boys. The Shooting Master has now disappeared from the scene. It fell from grace because shooters after World War II found they could knock out higher scores and win more matches with the auto pistol. That discovery sounded the death knell for the cylinder gun. Whenever I could, I shot shoulder-to-shoulder matches. I did not always win, but I annexed enough first places to come favorably to the attention of the bureaucrats. Not unpleased with the publicity, they decided the patrol had better commence some kind of regular shooting practice. At the time I joined up, the Big Depression was on in full force. For a solid year after I signed on, there were no more hirings. I was the junior member of the entire force. Then the Department of Labor shook a little extra money out of the Congress and hired 100 new officers. This was all through the U.S. Civil Service, and these jazzbos had passed a written examination and withstood an oral interview. They showed up, most of them sent to the Mexican border where the action centered. It was this sudden influx which induced Washington brass to ever so hastily inaugurate a firearms training regime. I scoured around at Strauss and purloined enough lumber from the Southern Pacific Railroad to build a series of backboards for target frames. I then ran to Fort Bliss and talked the Army out of a big roll of Army L targets, also a goodly supply of the old Army pistol silhouette target. I was in business. I'll load up these recruits and we'll haul them out to Strauss and turn them over to you, Chief Horsley advised me. I was ready for them. Every man Jack had the old Army Colt Model 1917, and I had a case of 45 issue fodder. I lectured the class on the fundamentals of good pistol pointing and illustrated each point as we proceeded. Then we moved in on the bullseye, the Army L target. This is fired at 25 and 15 yards, and the bull is 5 inches in diameter. It was easy as pie, but these recruits were for the most part inexperienced with pistols, and scores were low. There was a second interlude, this firing on the silhouette target. It was limited to 25 yards and moved forward to 5 yards. At this latter distance, the shooter had to make a quick draw and fire 5 shots in 4 seconds. For some reason which I cannot explain from this time and distance, I insisted that the officer had to fire with only one hand. Since then, we've learned that it is much more deadly to take the pistol in both hands. It is a pity I did not grasp this salient fact during those early days. In the beginning, I established scoring levels, and a man might qualify as a marksman, a sharpshooter, or an expert. There were no badges to indicate his degree of skill, no pay incentive, and indeed, if he did not qualify at all, there was no stigma attached. These buckos were all on probation. The lack of interest and lackluster skill some exhibited should have been enough to have seen them kicked out, but they were not. Fortunately, the majority were keenly interested, and it was from some of these early classes that we got our service team members, sterling shooters like Harlan Carter, Bill Toney, Bob Jackson, and Neeksey, along with Crosby and others. In those days, the practical police course was unknown. This course of fire was originated by the FBI and adopted by the police of the country. Likewise, the much more modern combat courses of fire were utterly unknown. Target pistol shooting was rarely at any kind of silhouette targets. Only at Camp Perry did you find the Colt silhouette and the Army silhouette, and these firings were rather lightly regarded. With this as background, I arrived at a course of fire for the Border Patrol officers in my district. This was a graduated sort of thing, and the officer who qualified expert on the Army L target went on, during the next firing, to the so-called Camp Perry or police course, all fired on the standard American bullseye. Finally, if he made expert on the Camp Perry police course, he graduated to the national match course. This was shot at 50 and 25 yards, and was only for the service team members, really. The silhouette course remained the same for everybody. It was shot at 5, 15, 25, and 50 yards, in short time limits with the right and the left hand. At 5 yards, the shooting was double action for a fast draw. Everyone had to fire every 90 days, and while they were qualification scores, no one was penalized if he couldn't hit the target more than half the time. I had by this time been at Strauss for 5 years, and with the accelerated accent on firearms training, the Border Patrol made me the instructor of firearms for the entire service. This came about in an amusing way. I had won the pistol championship of Texas a couple of times, and was also eligible for promotion to the rank of senior patrol inspector. This was like being boosted from corporal to sergeant in the Army. Not a hell of a big thing, but after 5 years a feller felt like he ought to get some kind of a kick upstairs. About 16 officers were promoted, but my name was not on the roster. I was mad as hell. I went in to see Chief Horsley and told him that the Colt Company was going to hire me as a field representative, and that my job chiefly would be to make all the bigger tournaments, go to the national sporting goods shows, and otherwise boom all Colt shooting irons. The fact was, Colt had made no such offer. The Commissioner of Immigration, a hell of a fine old scoundrel named McCormick, called me on the telephone and told me not to be hasty. "I think we have something for you," he said to me. Within 10 days came an order making me the instructor of firearms for the entire U.S. Border Patrol, at a salary of $2,900 per annum. This made me the highest paid border patrolman. I suspect if I hadn't have resorted to the ploy about the Colt Company, I'd be right there in El Paso today, still drawing a common PI's stipend. As the Great Depression eased somewhat, the Border Patrol, at my insistence, purchased new revolvers for the entire service. I had small love for the Smith & Wesson, a dislike which I share to this day, and so I elected the Colt New Service in .38 Special Caliber. The revolver had a 4-inch barrel, fixed sight, and a square butt. There were 642 revolvers purchased at a cost to the U.S. government of $19 each. I had the entire shipment sent to me in El Paso. I shot each revolver and sighted it in. The sights were all the fixed type. The front sight was a great upstanding chunk of metal. The rear sight was a rectangular notch cut into the top strap. I made a tool to bend the front sight either right or left to bring the gun to zero. I filed down the front sight if the gun shot low and filed the rear notch if it shot high. After I had all the revolvers fetched to zero, the pistols were shipped off to the various districts along either border. Once the guns were issued, there were all manner of bellyaches. "I got a new gun and the front sight is crooked," was a common beef. I should really have put a note in with each chest explaining that I had fired the revolvers and adjusted the sights, if somewhat crudely. 30 years later, these old Colt 6-shooters were still in the hands of the Border Patrol. Once a qualification course of fire had been established for all patrol officers, and a .38 revolver issued, the BP, always short of money, could not find the funds to buy ammunition in sufficient quantities to permit the necessary firing. I resolved this by purchasing for each border district along the entire Mexican frontier, as well as all the Canadian border and the state of Florida, the Star Reloader. This was a machine loader which was capable of 600 loaded cartridges per hour. I also bought Hensley gang molds so that we could produce the necessary 38 bullets to keep up with the Star machine. This all worked out very well. The qualification firing proceeded on schedule. With the success of the El Paso contingent of the Border Patrol, the other district organized service patrol teams, and this was a most laudatory move, for it gave the all-service team a great deal more strength. Every district had a bang-up good marksman or two, and when these lads came together for a shootout to see who would represent the patrol, the final squad was always a tough one. In El Paso, we, that is the pistol team, built our own range, and Chief Horsley permitted his people to practice 3 times weekly. Those shooters who showed some promise were generously allowed to attend the thrice weekly practice of the regular squad. This sometimes amounted to 3 full teams. A team in those days amounted to 5 regular firing members. This was a most beneficial gesture on the part of Horsley, and permitted me to gather together my most promised candidates. Amonteni and a couple of buddies of his, the brothers Toole, Orrin and Merrill, were quite sure they were national team material. The 3 were shortly eliminated by the better shooters in the group. I was happy to see them fall by the wayside. There were others who were fair shots, fellows like Hull, House, Humphreys, and Harry Lennon. None were quite the caliber we needed. The BP team went off to the Texas state pistol matches and came home with a state championship. We sallied forth again and annexed the Texas Police Championship. In both cases, I somehow contrived to win the individual championships. This helped the stature of the pistol squad, which had a somewhat dubious standing with the service. We got no per diem allowances while away at shooting matches. There were no monies to pay the entry fee, no mileage allowance for travel, and the guns and ammunition were all out of pockets of the individual team member. Despite these penurious shortcomings, the BP team was acknowledged the best in Texas. Now, this is no small nor yet trifling matter in the Lone Star State. The pistol is a most important item with the average Tejano, and the top shooter is looked upon as pretty much as John Wesley Hardin was regarded during his heyday. Hardin, let it be explained, was Texas' most notable gunman. He shot 40 men and thus immortalized himself, even though immortality seems to have escaped his 40-odd victims. At any rate, it was a fine and wholesome feeling to know that we were number 1. It has always been my experience that it is a great deal easier to coach a fellow when both the student and the coach know that the latter is the better shooter of the two. I have found that when I impart the final words, the fact that I am the champion and the recruit knows it really helps to put the word across. The new job as instructor in firearms, I never did know who the jerk was in the Washington office that insisted that I was not an instructor of firearms, but an instructor in firearms. But at any rate, the job included travel along all the Mexican border in a similar swing during the National Midwinter Championships, and in making this considerable sortie, I bumped into a lot of patrol officers who were about as interested in proving their pistol skill as they were in the alligator problem in Louisiana. These birds would go to sleep during the preliminaries of the firing instructions, would hit the target with only half their shots, and didn't give a damn. One fat P.I., this was in Florida, came to the instruction without his holster. When he rammed the new service revolver in the waistband of his size 48 trousers, managed to pull the trigger before the gun was clear of his pants. The bullet went in and out of his blubber for about 3 inches. He wasn't hurt, but plenty frightened. There were others who listened intently, tried hard, and were keenly interested in improving their gun handling skill. I enjoyed helping this class of officer, and some of them became so good they journeyed over to Detroit and tried out for the service team before the national matches. There was a good deal of jealousy in the Border Patrol towards those members who constituted the district pistol teams, and most especially directed at the service team. Just a bunch of damn deadbeats, got a good thing going and shoot instead of shouldering their share, was the often repeated comment. In this regard, while I was still at Strauss, old Duval and I got on the trail as a bunch of smugglers. These contrabandista walked all night. They crossed the Mex-U.S. border between number 3 and number 4 monuments. then walked their loads of liquor into the Rio Grande Valley some 20 miles north of the international line. Old Bill and I watched their comings and goings for several months and finally had an excellent impression of just how they traveled and where they would drop off the mesa into the valley. Likewise, about where the auto would meet them to retrieve the liquor and pick up the cargadores. "I reckon we can handle this bunch by ourselves," I told Duval. He looked a little dubious. Bill was not the fighting kind, and he would have preferred to run into El Paso and lay on with Chief Horsley for 3 or 4 others to help with the ambush. I vetoed that, mostly because there were never more than 5 or 6 in the party. There was one gun guard. We could tell that because he always walked apart from the others. Mexican smugglers, all being Indians, tend to march in single file, the leader picking the route and the others trailing along behind him. We elected to bushwhack this bunch along the road, free of cover and offering a shallow ditch for our cover. The smugglers had dropped off the mesa, walked a half-mile across the cotton patch, hit the road, and followed it for a mile before the car met them. At that juncture, where the band first struck the road, we waited. At about 3:30 a.m., we could hear the cans sloshing about as the contrabandista came on. In those days, the liquor was transported in 4.5-gallon cans and mostly consisted of alcohol. This was cut once it was on the U.S. side of the frontier and made into synthetic gin and other mixes. The cans were packed, 2 on the back and 1 in front of the carrier, and these offered up a considerable racket as the man slopped along. Old Duval was about 15 yards down the ditch from me. Bill had an old Winchester Model 54 rifle in .30-06 caliber. I had the Remington Model 2 automatic with its extended magazine. It was stuffed. Remington Model 11 automatic with its extended magazine. It was stuffed with double-aught buckshot. When the gang got abreast of my position, the gun guard had elected to walk apart from the group, and he was across the road from the others. I could see the 6-shooter in his hand. It was nickel-plated and shone brightly in the moonlight. I yelled, "Alto cabrones! Halt, you sons of bitches!" The hombre with the gun whirled on the command and commenced to trigger off shots wildly from the revolver. I shot him squarely in the front, and as he turned to run, spanked him in the rear with another load of blue whistlers. The range was about 15 short steps. Neither shot knocked him down. Indeed, neither charge of buckshot seemed to affect him in the least. He ran down past old Duval, and Bill shot him through both hips with a .06. The bastard ran another 50 yards and finally collapsed. He was dead when I gingerly eased up to him and gave him a hell of a kick in the backside. In the morgue, we had a look at his hips, and both hips shot to doll rags. I will never be able to explain. The cargadores spilled their loads and dusted their ass for Mexico. All we had for a long and sleepless night was one dead peladeo and a load of questionable alcohol. Another time, Duval and I started to town one day, and as the nearest route was along the river levee, we took the road. This was the levee beside the Rio Grande, the border stream. This river, let me add, is a mere trickle of water. It is more than 100 yards in width across the riverbed, but the water flow is a piddling trickle. A fellow can wade it and never get his knees damp. Across the river is the scurvy town of Juarez, the largest Mexican metropolis on the border, and a spot notable for more hardcore criminals and thoroughly bad hombres than any other half-dozen pueblos along the U.S.-Mexican frontier. On our side of the river and hard by the levee was the Mexican settlement. It was common practice to make the run across the all-but-dry riverbed with loads of liquor and dump them into one of the adobe jackals on the American side, and, before the Border Patrol could arrive on the scene, the liquor was safely secreted in one of the shacks. At any rate, as my partner and I tooled down the levee, only 6 blocks from BP headquarters, it was about 10 of the morning. Who should come marching across the international waterway but 6 smugglers, all with loads on their backs. These rascals ducked into an alley in the Mexican settlement and were lost to our view. We raced forward, and I fell out of the old sedan and raced down the alley after the lawbreakers. Old Duval, with all the stupidity for which he was noted, had left his pistol at home. He was unarmed and defenseless. As I raced down the alley, and the dripping footprints of the contrabanditos before me, I was considerably startled to see at the end of the narrow passage a gringo, rifle in hand. Now, it was mighty uncommon for gringos to get mixed up with the smugglers right at the water's edge. This was an almost surefire way to get shot. The white man usually stayed in the background, and after the Mexicans had gotten the booze across the Rio and had it well within the interior, the gringo came forward and took over. This white man, on the instant he saw me, swung up the rifle. We were only 10 steps apart, and I noted it was an old Winchester Model 95 lever gun. When I saw the rifle being fetched to shoulder, I dropped down on both knees and triggered off a couple of shots from my six-shooter. This six-gun deserves some description. It was a Colt News Service 45 caliber with a 2-inch barrel with the front of the trigger guard cut away to further a fast draw. Actually, the gun wasn't mine, but was on loan from George Parker. This hombre had been back at Camp Perry and had seen Fitzgerald, the Colt Company shooting ace, with a pair of the worked-over News Service 45s, so he came home and made up the one he had loaned to me. The rifle shot fired at me by the gringo went over my head, and the 2 rounds I banged off at him also went wild. I think we were both pretty scared. When he disappeared, I ran to the end of the alley looking for him. He was lying behind a car about 40 feet to my immediate front. I could see him, but not very clearly. At that moment, a big Mexican bailed out of the car and made a run for one of the nearby adobe shacks. I let drive at him and struck his rifle in the smallest stock, the big 250 grain bullet completely severing the stock from the rifle. I could see I had at least 2 gunmen to contend with, so I popped into a Mex Jackal, ran to the back door and locked it, and cat-footed it to the front again, where I looked out over the scene for possible targets. Old Duval, really caught with his pants down, wisely jumped into the patrol car and beat a retreat for BPHQs, which, as I have said, was only 6 blocks on down the levee. He gathered up reinforcements, and with the boys to lend support, returning to the scene. When the Border Patrol piled out, guns at the ready, the 2 smugglers came out of hiding. The 2 proved to be U.S. Customs patrolmen. They were in our territory, which had the border divided between the 2 so that the very thing which had occurred would not happen. This pair, led by a smart aleck son of a bitch named Bill Cole, had thought to dash into our territory, knock off the load of liquor, and get out before the Border Patrol was aware of their actions. A killing had been narrowly averted. I was personally sorry, as I'd have been happy indeed to have killed Coe. His father was a running mate of Billy the Kid up in New Mexico, and the son thought he was a pretty tough character. To say that I took a ribbing was an understatement compared to the comments after firing 2 shots at another fellow at 30 feet down a narrow alley and missing him. It was a disgrace which took a long time to live down.